The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, my name is Deirdre White, and I'm with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and ASDWA and EPA are pleased to bring you our webinar today on becoming financially resilient through asset management. So this is one of a three-part series we're doing for the Capacity Development and Operator Certification National Workshop. We hope you had a chance to listen to our webinar and participate in our Teams meeting last week, and you can see a recording of that on ASDWA's website. We also will be having the third and last webinar next week on August 25th on adaptive operator training and testing techniques. And we want to also just remind you that we have postponed the in-person workshop until next August in Alexandria, Virginia. So hopefully we can make that happen next year with the pandemic going on. And just a few housekeeping slides for you. We want to remind you, you can type your questions in at any time during the webinar. We will most likely only be taking clarifying questions if we take any at all, just due to the time constraints and the fact that we are going to be having a Teams meeting following the webinar where you can ask questions of presenters and have a discussion. And you can download the presentation slides and presenters information handouts from the control panel from GoToWebinar. This is for the Teams meetings that will start immediately after the webinar, or 15 minutes after the webinar. So you should have gotten a calendar invite with the Teams meeting link for either Group A or Group B. This is the format and the agenda for those Teams meetings. So as I mentioned, you can ask questions of the speakers, and then we'll also discuss challenges and successes and provide recommendations for EPA and ASWA. So we really hope that you all will participate in those Teams meetings and participate in the discussion and share those things with us during the dialogue. So if you did not receive a Teams meeting calendar invite, please contact Allison Flanagan at EPA at this address here on the screen. And after the webinar, we will have a video recording available on ASWA's website along with last week's webinar, and next week we'll also post the webinar there as well with the slides. And we will be sending a survey from GoToWebinar that will have an email link to go fill that out for today's session. So please do that so that we can get your feedback after the webinar and Teams meetings. So for today's webinar on becoming financially resilient through asset management, we have our presenters, Heather Himmelberger from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, Andy Yang from San Jose Water in California, and John Choate, I hope I said that correctly, from the city of Winooski in Vermont. So with that, let's go ahead and switch it over here to Heather. Heather, are you ready to go?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, great.
All right, good morning if you're on the West Coast, or good afternoon if you're anywhere else. And thank you so much for having me today to talk about, of course, my favorite subject, asset management. And specifically, we're going to talk today about asset management as a resiliency tool. So just a couple words about the Southwest EFC. We're located at the University of New Mexico within the Center for Water and Environment in the School of Engineering. And we started in 1992, which happens to be the year my oldest daughter was born, although I joined in '94. And then our mission statement is shown there on the bottom of the screen, and we now have a new website. So if you haven't visited our website for a while, I welcome you to go back to the Southwest EFC website and see all the changes. We work under contracts and agreements with federal, state, and local governments and private funders. We work all over the United States and the territories. And our specialty areas are, of course, asset management. And more recently, we are working on developing a framework that builds green infrastructure into the traditional gray asset management framework to develop one comprehensive framework that would include both green and gray assets. We also do a lot of work in water loss and water loss auditing and control. And then for those of you old timers in capacity development, you know how it used to always be called the three-legged stool. So I decided to bring back a blast from the past, and we do a lot of work related to capacity development in that area. And we also run an operator certification program for tribal operators in EPA Region 6. And then we also work with a few other regions under a different project. So we're also on the operator certification side of things. So now to the heart of the matter, asset management, which at its core is really a resiliency program, even if we don't necessarily think about it that way. And one of the things to think about is it's important that we do our basics well and the basic functions, because you can't really achieve what you want unless you're doing the basics well. So you're not going to win a soccer game or a football game or a baseball game if you don't know how to do the basics of, you know, running, catching, throwing, and that sort of thing. So asset management helps communities do the basics well. And doing the basics well will help us maintain resiliency to all kinds of outside stressors. So if we think about, you know, technical, managerial, and financial stressors to a water utility, I've just pulled up some. There's obviously more than what's on the screen, but the ones that affect technical would be those things that actually affect the assets or the operation of the facility. So something like a fire, a flood, an earthquake, a contamination event would have a big impact on the assets of a utility. So how would asset management help have technical resiliency? Well, with the inventory and the mapping, where you actually know what assets you have and you know where they're located, you can do all kinds of things. So if it was an event where you can't find your assets because they're under, you know, flood debris, if you have the GPS coordinates of that asset, you can find it anyway, even if you don't have those normal physical indicators of where something is. If you have to isolate a part of your system very, very quickly, if you know where your valves are, you can do that really fast. So having that inventory can help you before the event. It can also help you after the event when you're trying to work with FEMA to maybe restore some of those assets. It really helps you know what assets you have, so you can go right away to FEMA and say, these are the assets that were damaged. We know what condition they were in, how much they're worth, what kind of asset, that sort of thing. Also doing the operation and maintenance activities and making sure that the utility is kept up to par at all times is also one way to keep yourself resilient, because the more you're doing those kinds of things, the better able you are to withstand any kind of outside force. And then finally, spare parts. If you have spare parts available, you know where they are, you know where they're located, you can find them quickly and easily. If something happens to an asset, you're able to operate very, very quickly to fix the situation to make that asset work better. If we think of managerial stressors, we might think of contamination events again, climate change, because that's something we have to manage as we go forward, and then a pandemic such as the one we're facing in COVID, which really affects the staffing and that type of situation within our utilities. So how does asset management help with managerial resilience? One way is by understanding the level of service. So if you know what it is you're trying to provide for your customers, you can really focus in on what do I have to do right here and now to keep the level of service going for my customers. Another way is having the risk, and understanding risk is really, really important, because when we do a risk profile, then we're going to know the assets that are most likely to fail and the ones that are really serious consequence if they do. And those are assets we should be addressing prior to any kind of outside stressor. But if not, those are the assets that are most likely to fail, because the ones that are in the worst condition are going to cause us the most problem if there's an outside stress. So we know right away which assets to be monitoring, to be looking for, to be watching out for. Having a capital improvement program of some kind is really valuable to help you figure out, you know, when you're trying to recover, what do you have to do in terms of replacements. And then again, going back to staffing, we don't always think about staffing as an asset management component, but the staff is really the most important piece or the most important asset that the utility has, because they're the ones that are the eyes, the ears, and the operational heart of the utility. So knowing what staff you have, what they're doing, who has what skills and trainings and that sort of thing can really help you if you have to change staffing, like this pandemic has really affected where people work, how they work, and that sort of thing. So having information about staffing can be really helpful. And then the focus of today is more on the financial part. So what stressors might affect financial? Everyone we've talked about before certainly has a financial component, but we also have this additional component of what's happening in the world around us. So as we have an economic downturn, we might have issues related to the finances of the utility. So they might be caused from one of these other events, or they might be caused from something else, like a business closure and that sort of thing. And that could really affect the finances of the utility. So let's focus in on financial impacts that might occur from COVID. So that could be changes in usage patterns. So we have seen at some utilities where the amount of residential usage is going up and the amount of usage from non-residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, those types of things is going down. Well, the overall amount of water might be the same, or it might have even increased a little bit, but the revenue might be different because you might charge residential customers less than you charge non-residential customers. So that could have an impact on your finances. Many utilities have canceled shutoffs during the pandemic, so that might have an impact. There might be unemployment impacts where customers don't have the ability to pay, and maybe there's more customers that don't have an ability to pay than before. There could be lost income investment income if your utility has outside investments. And maybe there's business closures where a large water user is now closed, either temporary or permanently, and that could have an impact on your finances. So how might asset management help with financial resilience? So let's look at a typical situation. So if you look at the colored boxes on the right and consider them to be essentially the total activities that a utility has to do. So just consider that to be all the things that in a given day, month, year, a utility has to do. And then on the left, it's the amount of resources and money and time that you have available to do the things on the right. And the typical situation is there's never enough money and resources to do all the things that you want to do. So what happens is you have to spread the money around, and if you don't really think deeply about what you're doing and don't have a good strategic way of deciding, some activities might not get done at all, some might get completely done, and some are partially done. So you might not be spending your money in the most advantageous way possible. So when you have asset management, it really helps you decide where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, so you can really spread your money out in the most efficient, effective way possible. And as your efficiency improves, you can also have the added benefit of maybe the colored boxes actually shrink in size because you can do things a little bit more cheaply and efficiently to get a little bit closer between the green box and the colored boxes. So I just wanted to give a really quick example of Water One. We have two other examples coming up in just a moment who will go more deeply into what their utilities are doing right now. But I just wanted to bring up Water One. This is an organization we trained in asset management many years ago, and they've really done a great job in taking off with asset management and really using it to their advantage. So during this pandemic, they have seen some increase in the number of customers who are unable to pay, although their community is not one that's particularly economically distressed, but they still have seen an uptick in people who can't pay right now. And they were expecting to have a rate increase in the new fiscal year that started in July of 3%, but their board felt that that would really be not the right thing to do at this time. So they decided not to go ahead with the rate increase, which meant that all of a sudden you have less money than you thought you were going to have. And then to compound that, their investment income went down, so they actually have even less. So they had to rely on their asset management plan to really tell them, what are the things that we can put off that won't hurt the overall service to our customers, and really have relied on the capital improvement planning portion as well as the level of service goals to help them choose what to do and what not to do. So next I want to just tell you real quickly about some resources available to states and water utilities in asset management. We created an asset management switchboard that's a collection of all the free resources out there available. If there's anything that you think should be up here and isn't, we have a little button that you can email us, and let us know. We are hosting some resources that some other agencies were not able to host, and we're happy to do that as well. So we'd like to, have a one-stop shopping for you to come and get resources. Also on our webpage, we have resources available. So our AM Can Work guide is there, as well as our Asset Management IQ. And that's a place where you can kind of set your baseline in asset management, as well as measure your progress. And there's many, many other resources on our website as well. And then finally, I wanted the states to know that we have resources available to help them in integrating the asset management into your capacity development programs. So by December of 2021, all the states must take a look at their capacity development programs, integrate asset management into that, and present back to EPA what your plan is. So if you would like any kind of assistance in this area and have not already reached out to us, please do so. My email is up there, heatherh@unm.edu. We're working with our Wichita State Environmental Finance Center as a partner, and we're available to help you if you need any help in working through your capacity strategies and how to incorporate asset management. So as I wrap up, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have any questions or you have any requests for assistance, you can enter them into the chat box or the question box, and we'll be able to see that and be able to reach out to you. So if you don't want to email and you'd rather do it this way, that's fine. So either way, that's great. And we look forward to working with you. So with that, I will now turn it over to our next speaker, Andy Yang, who will talk about San Jose.
Mute. Hi. Hopefully you can hear me okay and see what I'm presenting here. So thank you all for the opportunity here to share a little bit about how we are using asset management to become more resilient financially, operationally. It's all linked together. So our agenda here for today is quickly here just to go over San Jose Water System, then the goal of asset management at San Jose Water. Then really the meat of this is twofold. The enterprise risk identification and prioritization, which was very much overlapped with the OWIA effort, and then work activity risk evaluation during the COVID-19 pandemic. So hopefully you find this intriguing. I know that for our organization, there's been a lot of progress made from an asset management standpoint, and it was a very cross-departmental, cross-functional, collaborative effort. And so we were all, I was involved definitely, but there were a lot of other people involved. And it was a great organizational effort that intrigued us as an organization. And hopefully you find it interesting. So we were established over 150 years ago in 1966. And we serve over 1 million people in the Silicon Valley and greater San Jose metropolitan area. And just to get a sense of our system and the scale, we have 3 water treatment plants, 2,400 miles of pipe, 340 pumps and motors, 100 wells, and you can see the rest there. And so asset management is, it's a big undertaking. It makes it challenging to have so many assets, but it also makes it fun and rewarding as well. And the goal is really, with all of these assets, it's to really derive value from it, to really meet the mission and the goals of the organization, which in the end is to serve our customers, our communities, and protect the environment. And also we have our employees that we want to make sure we're taking care of, and shareholders, because we are an investor-owned utility. So to make sure they're getting the return that they need to keep us sustainable. So here is the goal of asset management in San Jose Water. It is to maximize value derived from assets by optimizing the balance between risk, cost, and level of service. So this is the goal of asset management in general, not just at San Jose Water, but an asset is not necessarily only equipment. It's not necessarily just a pump or a motor or a tank or whatever it might be, or a pipe. It could even be data. And like Heather was talking about a little earlier, it can be very linked, and it should be very linked to human resources and all of those decisions. So here, this threefold goal is a little bit counterintuitive to most people who look at this for the first time. So we want to keep our level of service high, but usually when you do that, your cost will go up too. So that is the challenge. Usually when your cost goes down, your level of service goes down and your risk goes up. So it seems like all the arrows are in the wrong directions, but this is the goal, and it can be done when you have a comprehensive way of looking at asset management. This is what we're going after. And today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the risk aspect of our goal, and that is where resilience, including financial resilience, falls in. And there is overlap between risk, level of service, and cost, but I'm going to focus on the risk today. So here, this slide might be a little different if you download the handout. I modified this slide a bit to show risk in two different ways. And in the handout, you'll probably only see the equation up top, the probability of failure times the consequence of failure, and that equals risk. And you can plot that and visualize it on a plot like I have here. These are our pipes. Most of our pipes are in that moderate consequence and probability of failure range. We have a few that are kind of very high in consequence and probability of failure, which we want to address very soon. However, when you're looking at things from a threat perspective, an outside threat perspective like earthquakes or hurricanes, whatever it might be, there's another way to look at risk, and that is the probability or likelihood of threat occurrence times the consequence of threat impact times the vulnerability of that asset to the threat. So that is another way to, it's an important way to look at it when you're trying to factor in threats. So we have different types of risk evaluation that we care about. We have individual asset risk, station level risk, and enterprise level risk. There is overlap between these three, but here, what we've done at San Jose Water is this is how we separated it out. We have in-depth risk evaluation that we've done for pretty much all of our major assets on an individual level. However, when you're talking about station level risk and enterprise level risk, you can't necessarily deal with it in an identical fashion. So here we took a higher level risk evaluation approach, and we considered various outside threats. We had a list of probably 20-something threats that we considered to start with. And we embarked on a joint effort between asset management and our business resiliency department. So we took this on, and it was a great collaborative effort. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the next couple slides. So if you want to evaluate your risk, the first thing you need to do is have a criteria. So what we did was we created a simple criteria. Remember, this is high level. This is not an in-depth, extremely numerical analysis. This is more of a high-level analysis that we did for our station and enterprise risks. And here we have the consequence of threat to the asset. That means if the threat occurred and adversely impacted your assets, what is the consequence? And we took that from a triple bottom line perspective: the social impact, the financial impacts, and the environmental impacts. We had a way of scoring it. We had an equivalent dollar amount, as you can see on the right. And then we also looked at the likelihood of threat occurrence. How likely is it that the threat will occur? And then there is a third component, which is the vulnerability component. That's something that we're going to add in and assess as a next step, because that takes, to do a very broad evaluation, there isn't, once you start doing a vulnerability assessment, it starts getting very detailed and it's very time consuming. So from a high level perspective, it's probably best to focus on these two to know where you want to focus your vulnerability assessments. So here we have a criteria that we got into place, and then we were able to do threat asset pair analyses. So we had, from a station level, we had 210 stations that we considered. Those are all of our stations. And 4 different threats that we were concerned with. These are our kind of our priority 1 threats: earthquakes, wildland fires, long-term outages, power outages, and confirmed contamination. There are other threats that we also considered, including pandemic, though that they were of concern to us, but these were the highest level concern. We could talk about why maybe in the breakout session if you're curious. But for here, we have 210 assets, and we did an analysis. We compared them against all 4 threats, each of those assets. Now, that is a lot of analysis. So how do you have time to do it all? You don't. You simply don't. You can't do 840 analyses. However, so what we did was we created groups of assets based on their characteristics, and the groupings might be, for example, and these are station level assets. So it might be groundwater stations might be one group, and booster pump stations might be another group. Tanks might be another group, like tank stations. The treatment plants might be another group. So we have different groups, and even within those groups, there might be different types of stations within those groupings. So you can have subgroups. So we created all of these groups, and then for each of those groups, we had 1 or 2 exemplar assets or stations that were representative of the rest of the stations in that group. Then what we did is we did an analysis, a threat asset pair analysis with the exemplar stations, and then we basically used those scores for exemplars and brought them on to the rest of the group and made adjustments based on different types of factors. For example, for a groundwater station, you might be looking at the capacity of the station, the location, how close is it to an area of concern? Is it close to an environmentally sensitive area? Is it susceptible to wildland fire, or is it close to a fault? And these are all different considerations that might change your consequence or likelihood of threat score that we did in a pretty automated, it's a detailed yet automated fashion. And so we were able to come up with all 840 threat asset pair analyses in that way. And we did something similar with the enterprise level threats and assets. So we did 21 threat asset pair analyses for these larger scale risks. And for example, groundwater aquifer contamination. If your groundwater aquifer gets contaminated, that doesn't just affect one station or one asset. You're talking about impacting our whole operation. I mean, we can't serve 1/3 of our water supply, or it'd be hard to. So that would be a good example of an enterprise level risk. Fuel shortages, pandemics, droughts, wildland fires, terrorism, cyber attacks, earthquakes. These are all different types of enterprise level threats that we're very concerned about. And we did a consequence of threat and the likelihood of threat evaluation. The ones that came up the highest are here. Some of it is grayed out intentionally, but the idea is we want to be able to clearly see, what are the threat asset pairs that really pose the greatest concern to us, and then what do we do with it? I mean, you can have this data, but if you don't do anything with it, then it's not very useful. So our asset management committee basically will take on these threat asset pairs, evaluate them, and come up with risk mitigation plans, 1 at a time or 2 at a time. Some of these are, they're very kind of wide scale, broad, high level, and very impactful threats and risks. So it's not something that one department will be able to just take on their own. It's something that needs to take, it's going to involve collaboration between departments. So that's a little overview of how we did our risk identification and prioritization for our enterprise. And now I'm going to shift gears to the COVID-19 pandemic and how we dealt with that. So here we halted the majority of field activities due to COVID-19, and office staff worked from home, but they were able to continue doing their work. and only mission essential field activities were allowed to resume. But of course, even that required a lot of changes to procedures, safety, policies, SOPs were changed, a lot of changes there. But mission essential field activities we knew had to resume. Now, interestingly enough, though, there are some activities that, I shouldn't just say some, many activities that a utility might need to do that are not necessarily mission essential for a given week or a month, but once you start pushing 2 months or even 3 months, they become very critical and mission essential, basically, at that point. One example might be, I don't know, a good one might be meter reading. We have this is one that we went back and forth on, meter reading. Well, we can still serve water without reading the meters, so we did cancel that activity temporarily, but we knew pushing it out 2-3 months, we weren't reading people's meters, and that was really impacting us from a financial standpoint. Of course, customers didn't, they had complaints too, but they understood what the situation was. However, that impacts us from a financial standpoint in our finance department, and what is different items that they need to report out on, and even for investors and all that, it had a big impact when you're talking about pushing it out 2-3 months. So we needed a systematic and defensible way to resume that work, not just that particular activity, but all activities. How are we going to prioritize that, and how quickly do we need to bring them back? So the Health and Safety Department led a collaborative enterprise-wide risk evaluation effort, and it was really a great undertaking, a good job that they did. There was alignment with the asset management framework, the risk framework, and here's a snapshot of a spreadsheet that we used. And basically what it is we evaluated every single work activity, so that's a lot of work activities. And of course, some were grouped that were similar, but we evaluated all of them, and the evaluation was considering the triple bottom line, so different kinds of social impacts, environmental impact, and financial impact as well. And we did we looked at the likelihood of the threat happening and the consequence of the threat. So, for example, meter reading. If if someone's going out to do meter reading, what is the consequence of them and the likelihood of them getting sick from COVID, and also getting others sick? And how does that impact us financially? How does that impact the environment? How does that impact us from a regulatory and legal standpoint? So these were all different considerations that were ranked and scored on a 1 through 5 scale. And
hey, John, or excuse me, Andy,
yes.
we need to move on to John's presentation. Would you mind just wrapping up?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you. So we have the risks were evaluated. I'll wrap up in 1 minute here. The risks were evaluated in 3 ways. What's the risk of not doing the activity? What's the risk of doing it? And what's the risk of doing it with your controls in place, necessary administrative or engineering controls to reduce your health and safety risk? So the activities, this is the last 2 slides here. Activities with not to do risks were considered first because that had the biggest impact on our company for not doing the activity. And they were, once the residual risk was brought low enough, we would implement and do the activity. And these were reevaluated on a weekly basis. So in conclusion, our asset management framework was used to identify and prioritize large-scale risks. And we collaborated with our business resiliency departments and the health and safety departments, So we had great collaboration, cross-departmental collaboration, and asset management is playing a very critical and important role to keeping us resilient operationally and financially. So that concludes my presentation, and I will pass it on.
Afternoon, John Choate here. We couldn't be more polar opposite, Andy. I think we're quite a bit smaller, clearly, and no less important relative to asset management. I think the size of the two communities is pretty apparent, but the task of asset management was the same at the beginning. We haven't had it for the number of years that you have, perhaps, but we have put our heart and soul into it. It's taken a little bit of effort to afford these things. I think the questions that I wanted to try and answer on this program was how asset management program has allowed us to do better assign work to our employees, how helpful that has been to our community, having the Vermont grant program that allowed this, and how things relative to the pandemic has created a whole new animal. So as you can see by this slide, we're just looking at the beginning of time. We bid it, we purchased one, shortlisted down to 3. We ended up with this next gen, which is coincidentally out of Sacramento, looking for a program that would help our customers, our employees, and the community at large. The Public Works Department tries to, everybody worth their salt, no matter what the size community, has asset management, basically, whether it's written down or just a roll of maps. But everybody in their minds has an idea what's priority. So this program has given us a good clearinghouse for that information. It's no longer institutional knowledge. It's available to everybody. Most of the staff has really embraced this, and luckily we were able to get a few grants through the program and helped us implement this whole thing, because it was daunting at first. Anybody who's taken on asset management knows that buzzword equals one more thing to do. I know personally I do water, sewer, stormwater, and a wastewater plant and all the associated appurtenances that go along with it. Yes, I have 12 staff, but this was one more thing to try to implement, and it was a little daunting. So putting this to use, as you can see on that left-hand side of that toolbar on our dashboard, we have things that are in the software. So we bought modules that were able to provide us service requests for our customers. The call can come in, or eventually we can open that up to our customers and they can request a service. So we're really the first line of introduction to the Public Works and our community. So having something that was usable, friendly, and would provide us with something we could generate a work order from was important. So we have things in that first module that allows us to get the customer's information, find the asset that they may be talking about, whether it be a hydrant or a valve or a tree in their yard or in their right-of-way, and create a work order from that. So that gives us all that information in one spot. And loading this in has been the important part of generating a work order. So having everybody's activity level in there was a big part of the implementation. So as you can see from that left-hand side, we've got things like creating a map program on GIS. We GPS every structure like everybody does in asset management. Luckily, we were able to hire interns from the local school, University of Vermont. She turned out to be a whiz, and unlike us dinosaurs, knew exactly how to operate through this whole morass of technology. So having that help through the implementation was huge. So going into a work order, we have that. All of our employee information is down here on the left-hand side with the person, looks like a figure. All of our warehousing inventory, we never had any of this things in one location. So now that we do, things are starting to get a little smoother. So we're no longer struggling with getting it all into the program. We're now building that program. Creating these tools that we have for reporting and capital improvement is really just in its infancy. But going to a council and trying to sell a utility project has been made a lot easier in order to have all this information. It's just not John saying, hey, we should do Union Street, top to bottom, complete street rebuild. Now we can take that information of the number of breaks and the issues that we've had on that street and build a case. So going into like a service request module, this is what we see. So quickly, we can tell Gail Hance called in. She had a issue with a manhole that was noisy. I can generate a work order easily from something like this and get it to someone to go take care of. So we would have lowered that manhole probably, but we're doing that street. So that's something that I can pass on to Ms. Hance, is that we're working on this, and the reason it's taking so long is we're doing a complete rebuild of that street. So generating a work order gives us somebody to push this to. Street department will be doing that manhole work. What is it that we need to do? It's all generated here into a work order. It's gotten really simple, and the nice thing about it, in this in this other slide rather, is I can now true cost this project. So I know what these employees, who was involved in it, what the employee cost was, and what, that was the next slide, and what the equipment was that we used for that resource or for that repair. So we always just guessed at it. I mean, it was who spent what time and how much equipment we used. And now I can actually, if this was going to be billed to someone, I could generate an invoice and say, this was a private contractor. Here's what we did to repave that driveway if that were the case. So it's been a real chore getting it moving, but now that it is, it's working out all the details. Here was our GIS. You can see by all the layers in here, I can tag whatever I want to look at on or off and make it a lot less clustered. Zero in on that, whether it's a thumbtack or just a paragon around it, and pull that asset up. And so yeah, like I said, we've been ground truthing all of our connectivity of these water lines, sewer lines, storm drain lines. We had pretty decent maps, but the connectivity was a bit of a task. And I think having all this information for such things as water breaks answers that question as to how has this been helpful to us. Small department, so when the staff was working from home or sent home during the initial stages of the pandemic, guess who was the only guy working? 2 or 3 of us, myself. So knowing exactly where these valves were, if we had an issue, was paramount. We benefited from all the work we had done before. So when we do a inspection on something, here's an example of a hydrant. So this hydrant, got a quick picture of it. Every season we come by and we will operate that hydrant, just like everybody else does, except I'll put in all this pertinent information of any type of condition in here, any type of thing that we need to do to this particular hydrant, and we're starting to build that data for that. And that's reaping benefits. I think in stage year 2 now, we're going through and loading this information in, and I can honestly say that I can skip right over the one that works great. And if I did some repairs in year 1 on that hydrant, now I'm going to make sure that that repair is still working and it's operating well. And I think the takeaway on this has just been that as the years go by, this is only going to get more and more easy, and having that ammunition, I think, for council and the administration as to what needs upgrading. When I go out and buy a half a dozen new hydrants, I know exactly which ones I'm replacing. So again, to answer that question about the state's AMP program, it really sped up our request for bidding and the decision-making process. We were able to hire a local engineering firm to help us through the bidding process and the implementation. And we wouldn't have probably been able to afford such a robust system as we have now with NextGen, something that we can grow with as we could when we had these grants. So as I mentioned before, the employees have really embraced this tool, and we're off and running. Essentially it.
Thanks so much, John. And we are going to now switch over to the team. So hopefully you all are able to participate in that, and you can ask John and Andy and Heather all questions on the teams meetings. They're going to be split up into the 2 different ones. So you'll have a couple, you'll have maybe at least one of them in each of the sessions. Reminder, they start right on the hour following this webinar. And if you have not received a calendar invite for the Teams meeting, please contact Allison Flanagan at EPA, and she will send you a calendar invite with the Teams meeting link. So thank you very, very much. Thanks to our presenters, and we'll talk to you all in just a few minutes.